as Toomey said, I'm going to start off talking about data-limited fisheries. I decided not to really try to attempt any kind of a tutorial on how to do it, but more just discuss some of the issues associated with managing data-limited fisheries. A lot of this I've borrowed from Meryl Rudd, who was a former student of mine who did her PhD on data-limited fish stock assessment. So a lot of the slides come from her work. There's also been there's a lot of interest in certainly in the U.S. in data-limited stock assessment, although what different people mean by data limited is often quite different. Let's see. Okay, let's just start with some introduction. So in the stock assessment is a process of using statistics to predict how fish populations will respond to alternative management choices. And so, as I said in the talk yesterday, roughly half of the global fish catch comes from stocks that are scientifically assessed through some kind of a process like this. And it takes a whole range of data, which I will talk about briefly, and it tries to estimate what's the status of the stock, what's its scale relative to what it could be, its productivity, which is usually, I tend to use productivity in the sense of the rate of production. So to me, a productive stock is one that has the potential to be harvested at a high rate. So say 20 or 30%, that would be a productive stock. An unproductive stock would be one that might sustain only a 5% annual rate of harvest. And then a lot of assessment techniques get very much into the calculation of uncertainty. And certainly 15 years ago, that was doing stock assessment and particularly measuring uncertainty was a major part of my research activities before I got interested in sort of the bigger global picture. Assessment of any kind requires some kinds of data. So we're going to talk a lot about data in the data-rich world. Monitoring is often monitoring. It's probably the next slide, actually. No, it's not the next slide. Okay, would be monitoring via scientific surveys, sometimes by catch per unit effort of the fishing fleet, measurements of size, size composition, age composition, sometimes tagging studies. Certainly in the developed world, we tend to rely on catch a lot, and so those all go into the assessment process. And then in the fisheries management process, ideally, although certainly not always, the results of the assessment are used to make any decisions. I'd say that in some sense we might divide the world into two groups: those where the decision is going to be one of a quota. So that would be the case for most Icelandic fisheries, most American fisheries, most European fisheries. In fact, most fisheries in developed countries these days are managed. The decision is what is the quota. In much of the world, and I'd just say the data limited world, it's almost probably impossible to manage most of the fisheries on the basis of regulating catch. It's difficult to monitor catch, difficult to enforce catch regulations, and I should say that that's not just a it's not a developed versus developing world thing. For instance, in most recreational fisheries, it's pretty difficult to measure the catch, even in countries like the United States and Canada, and we tend to not try to regulate those fisheries by regulating the catch, but rather by regulating the length of the fishing season or the gear or things like that. Okay, and so in any system where you're doing assessment, you tend to have a loop of monitoring data goes into assessments. Assessment produces a decision rule that produces a fishery. The fishery is monitored, and you go around in this process in some cases on an annual basis. In other fisheries, you might be only doing the assessment and changing the decision every few years. Does Iceland update everything every year? I don't know. Yes? Okay. Key point is fisheries are rarely managed if they're unassessed. If you don't have, I keep thinking I'm tied to something. If you don't have this step, then it's pretty hard to make any kind of updates of your decision rules if you're not measuring what's going on in the fishery in some kind of a rigorous sense. And again, this is a slide. Did I show this yesterday? I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't. Yes. I did. Okay. The green indicates the proportion of the catch in the country that comes from stocks that are assessed, and the key point is that through most of the tropical world, very few stocks are assessed, and I would argue that very few are actively managed in any kind of this kind of a system. I mean, there are management rules in place, as I mentioned. The closed seasons through much of South and Southeast Asia, but those are not really updated in this kind of a sense, although there is a much less formal sense that if things are perceived to be going bad, the length of the closed season may be increased. Okay, and again, as I mentioned yesterday, in general, there's appears to be a pretty good correlation between the countries in the world that don't have much in the way of assessment tend to also have fish stocks that are regarded as being in poorer status. Another way of looking at this comes from the Costello et al. The first Costello paper that attempted to estimate the status of unassessed stocks, and it was there really appears to be quite a different trend. The solid black line is our estimates of the status from this paper of assessed stocks, and the dashed line is estimates of the status of unassessed stocks. And then again, that's true not only in the developing world, it's also true in the developed world. The unassessed stocks in the developed world, of which there are many, they tend to be small, our estimates are that they are in distinctly worse shape than the assessed stocks. Okay. Now, this method, and this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time talking, this method was based on using the FAO landings database, and one of the problems with many of the fisheries of the world, particularly the smaller fisheries, is that catch data is usually not particularly reliable. And almost all of the assessment methods used in the developed world rely on catch data. And so one of the themes of what I want to talk about is probably the biggest divide in data limited is whether you actually have catch data that you believe is reliable. And I think the most promising techniques for assessing data limited stocks are those that don't assume you have reliable catch data. So you're in a very different world than the world of ICs or the world of the US in terms of assessments, where catch data is central. And we're going to talk a fair bit about how you assess the status of stocks when you don't have catch data. What about fisheries without reliable catch data? Okay. And part of this is that quantifying total catch is a major challenge. That if you have small-scale fisheries that have hundreds of landing places, very difficult to design a sampling scheme. You can't go to every boat, so you have to have a sampling scheme. It's very difficult to get those in place. We have the same problem with recreational fisheries in countries that have large marine recreational fisheries, that sampling them is very, very difficult. And when rich countries have attempted it, it's quite expensive. Then there's in terms of the population dynamics, fish that are discarded dead need to be accounted for because they are removals as much as fish that are landed. And estimating discards is very difficult to do. And then there is also illegal, unreported, unregulated catch. So I'm assuming it's the same in Iceland, that the first thing somebody doing a stock assessment in the US has to do is try to estimate the catch. Because as I said, the methods that are used there, catch is a central part of the assessment. One of the most common problems is taxonomic changes over the years that in many cases, again, this is largely a developed world, but I suspect it's the same problem one would have elsewhere. That different taxa in the 1950s and 60s might have been lumped together as sharks or rays or skates, and then over time the catch system got more classifications. It broke sharks down by species, broke rays down by species, and so when you're trying to do a stock assessment of a particular shark species, the question is, what was the catch back in 1950 of this species when they were just all sharks? And it's not uncommon for our scientists who are doing a stock assessment to spend several months trying to estimate what the catch history of their stock was. Also dealing with discards, trying to estimate discards at a time that there were no observer programs, those kinds of things. So even for our fisheries, I have to admit I'm skeptical about our ability to estimate catch. And some of you may know there was a recent paper that attempted to estimate the total catch for all the world's fisheries. And I mean, I just have to laugh that, it's such an ambitious undertaking. It would have taken 100 times the resources they had to even pretend to do it right. I guess my big point is, so what? That we want to base our management not on what we think the catch was 20 or 40 years ago, but what's going on in the fishery now. And so that's why I'm particularly interested in methods that don't rely on catch data. I should say that Meryl, a student of mine, one part of her thesis was looking at how trends in unreported catch affect stock assessments. And it came out very different than most people would expect, in that what we believe has been happening is that illegal and unreported catch has generally been declining as fishery systems have gotten better. And if unreported catch is declining, it means that we are actually being unduly pessimistic about the status of fish stocks. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. So one approach would be to spend a lot of resources trying to improve catch data. one of the things I've done is I've looked at the FAO landings data, and because I've been a catch skeptic for a long time, I have to say. And if you just look at the interannual variability, that is, how much does the reported catch vary from year to year? It really depends on the size of the stock. That the big stocks, as I say, the 100,000 ton stocks, the million-ton stocks, vary a little bit from year to year. Some of the small pelagics over longer periods will fluctuate a lot, but if the coefficient of variation means anything to you, it's sort of on the order of 0.2, 20% variation from year to year in big stocks. If you get down to the small stocks, and remember I talked about the 20,000 stocks in the FAO catch data, you get down to 10-ton stocks and 1-ton stocks, the coefficient of variation can be greater than 1. It's giant variation. You'll see no catch for 3 years, and then 100 tons, 100 tons, 100 tons, then 0, 0, 0, then 100 tons, 100 tons. The FAO staff who run the database really, their advice, and I think they've published this, is not to believe the catch data for stocks of less than 3,000 tons. And very few countries have a catch reporting system. Well, I'm trying to think which country it was. I can't remember. It might have been New Zealand, but their statistical system contains, they have like 67 species in their statistical reporting system, but somehow they're reporting 120 species to FAO. So the question is, where are those extra 60, where's that data coming from? The answer is, someone's making it up. Okay, they're in an office, and I've been told this by people in a lot of countries that, yeah, the big species, we've got a statistical system, we can estimate the catch, but some official in an office somewhere, they've got a form they got to fill out, they just fill it out and send it off, and if that official changes, you go from 0 to 10, and anyway, so I'm a catch skeptic for the smaller fish stocks, certainly. Okay, the approach is to have alternative types of data and stock assessment that don't depend on catch data. Obviously, there's this continuum from data poor to data rich. I've got a project right now with 3 Latin American countries, with Mexico, Peru, and Chile, and part of the project was to do some data poor assessments. And it's proved to be a problem because, as Toomey said, every time we identify a fishery, all of a sudden data starts appearing that what we thought was data poor, all of a sudden there's, oh no, we've got this piece of data, we've got that piece of data, and it's proved to be a bit embarrassing that we had this whole toolkit of data poor assessment techniques that I will briefly describe, and we end up having more data than those things really call for, and we're sort of getting kicked back into the more standard, developed country kind of assessments. Okay, so this is again, we've got assessments, monitoring, decision rules. This circle, and over here that are the typical data-rich kinds of data: catch data, abundance index, lengths and ages, and you have research capacity. Another kind of thing that I don't know whether you would call it data or not is just basic life history. How long do these fish live? How old are they when they mature? What do they weigh as they get older? What's their growth curve like? And I should say that's really important because a lot of the data poor methods make assumptions about that the basic life history. And many of you may know there's a There's a big database called FishBase that can give you it's online. You can look up this by taxa, and in fact, almost everybody relies on essentially life history parameters by analogy. Well, okay, you've got a shrimp species. We haven't collected any data on this species in this country, but what people who have studied it will use that data. Again, in the data-rich end, we have the two most common kinds of stock assessments are either what are often called biomass dynamics models that just attempt to talk about the total biomass of the stock, and then there's various usually catch at age or catch at size models that are much fancier and assume you have consistent length data or age data. And this is the data-rich world, and we're going to move away from there, hopefully. Okay. So one of the things you can do is you can, in a data-poor sense, you can still have monitoring, assessment, and a decision rule. And I'm going to describe one pretty soon. So you can have what are called proxies, which is you've got a proxy is an estimate of a well, let's see, what's the best word for proxy? It's a concept of we're going to make our decisions based on where we are relative to a proxy. So the proxy I'm going to talk about that I think is a good model for catch independent management is a lobster fishery I know well, where the common perception of the people in the fishing industry was the fishery was not doing well. Okay, said this fishery is in trouble. So, why do you suppose the fishermen were saying this fishery's in trouble? Sorry? Lower catch per unit effort, that's right. So it's a pot fishery, they put down pots, and they were getting like 1/2 of a kilo on average when they lifted the pots, and the ones that had been there for 20 years remembered the time, the good old days, when they used to get 2 kilos a pot lift. Okay, now what I would argue is that kind of understanding is common in many, if not most, fisheries. In fact, I am hard-pressed to think of a fishery where people who've been there for 10 or 20 years can't tell you whether it's gotten better or worse or stayed the same. Okay, now, it can be confounded by improvements in technology and things like that. But what they've done in the lobster fishery, and I'll show you in a little bit, is they said, we want to rebuild this stock back to where we get 2 kilograms a pot lift. Okay? And what they did is they reduced their fishing effort until the catch per pot lift started to rise, and once they got to 2 kilograms a pot lift, then they let the fishing effort increase. Now, I mean, I think that I'll show you some data from Kenya in a little bit. That's the kind of thing one could do. It doesn't take, you don't have to measure the total. People say, well, to do catch per effort, you have to measure total catch, you have to measure effort. No, you don't. You just have to have a sample of some of the people who were fishing and what their catch per effort is. You don't have to have it all. Very common misunderstanding. Let's see. Okay, I got to remember all. Okay, at the data poor end, you can have these, well, as I say, life history based, and I'll talk about those because in some sense the simplest data poor methods really just look at the length of the fish in relation to the growth rates and the natural mortality rates. And if you know, as Toomey said, that if you know much about the biology of fish and you go into a market and you see the fish are all this big, okay? And you know either in the past they were this big or in other places they're this big, that's a very strong indication that you're overfishing that population. And I don't know, there's Serge Garcia is a fishery scientist who for many years was with FAO, and I remember him telling me he'd just returned from a trip to 2 countries in West Africa, which I can't remember which ones, and he said, the same species in one country they were this big in the market, and the other country they were this big. He says, so all you needed to know is that where they're this big, that country is not fishing very hard. They do not have any kind of a problem. When the fish get this small, you really have to worry that they're being overfished. And so you can do very simple assessments on that basis. Let's see. So you can do a system like this that might only be using the size of the fish. That you could have a trigger, that is, if the size of the fish drops below a certain size, then you need to reduce fishing effort. It's all possible. Okay, so I'm going to start, and this is where I'm on sort of dicey ground because I appreciate that most of you have had no exposure to fisheries population dynamics, and so and I just want to talk about one of the easiest measures to implement in some fisheries is size limits. That it's particularly true when you're dealing with somewhat sedentary invertebrates, lobsters, clams, abalone, anything that doesn't move much, that and you can get in your hand, crabs. That's the really common the common way you can manage those fisheries. But to understand what the appropriate size limit is, you have to understand the growth and the mortality of the species. So I'm going to do a little bit of that. I should say that I am not much of a fisherman, but the most recent fishery, the only fishery I participate in every year is a crab fishery. And that's because you can go fishing for crabs right in front of my son's house, and that fishery is regulated. This is a kind of regulation that is perfectly transportable to the most data limited place. There are effectively 2 significant regulations. One is there's a short season, about 8 weeks long. That's it. You can only. And the other is there's a size limit. Well, there's a size and sex limit. You can't retain females, and the crabs have to be above a certain size. And since for this species the females are smaller, the size limit is really, females never make the size limit. And that fishery appears to be perfectly sustainable. It's been going on in Washington State for 100 and some years. Seems to work just fine. And they do occasionally adjust the season if catches are very good. Then they might make the season a little longer. And it's really quite simple. The fishery opens up, and there's lots of big ones. Okay, I remember I went out with my son back in the beginning of the season, and we were getting 10 or 15 legal-sized crabs per pot. Oh, sorry, there was also a daily limit of 5 per person. Anyway, we had more than we could keep, and we just went out just at the end of the season, just beginning of September, last day of the season, and I think from 3 pots we had 1 legal-sized crab. So what's happening in that fishery is you're taking out all the legal-sized crabs pretty well over the course of the season. They grow rapidly. By next year, there will be a whole bunch more legal-sized crabs. But the basic population dynamics is, and this is the really important regulation, where do you set the size limit? okay? And the basic answer is you want to set the size limit bigger than the size at which they reproduce. So if your size limit is too small, no one will ever get big enough to reproduce. So you want to set the size limit bigger than the age at which they reproduce. And my friend and colleague Jeremy Prince from Australia has in the last 15 years sort of made his career traveling around the world to small communities, helping them figure out what the size limit should be for the species that they are managing. I want to talk a little bit about management options and what management options you can use. I've already mentioned a little bit about size and CPUE. I'll talk about the New Zealand rock lobster fishery a little bit and that CPUE-based decision rule, and then I'll just give you a hint of what can go into length-based assessments. So this is where I'm a little bit dicey, that one of the most important concepts in fisheries is based on the idea of yield per recruit. So I'm going to open up a spreadsheet with any luck. Let's try that. Yield per recruit. Okay, so what I have here, let's just make this bigger for the moment, is tracking the number of individuals across ages, but in this case it's not the number of individuals, it's the probability that an individual has survived. So we're going to start with one individual at age 1, and we can think of these ages as years, or you can think of them as months or even weeks, depending upon what kind of time scale is appropriate. And what we have is we have the individual getting heavier as it gets older. So if we go up here, this is, just as an example, this is what the weight of an individual at each age would be. Okay? And as most fish, most invertebrates have what we call asymptotic growth, that they tend to stop growing at some point. But the important part of this concept is if we talk of what we call the cohort biomass. That is, if you have, in fact, let's make this 1,000. Let's see if this works. Oops, oh, that's not zeros. 1, 2, 3. Okay. I'm going to start with 1,000 individuals. So let's assume that you had 1,000 individuals born on January, and these are 12 months of the year, and you have a certain fraction that are dying each time period. In this case, I have got 82% survival from month to month, okay? And I'm going to turn the fishery off. There's no fishery. So you start off with 1,000 individuals on January. You have 818 by February, and the number of individuals still alive of those 1,000 is declining. Okay, that's what's called a cohort. At the same time they're growing, each individual weighs more and more. So what you see in purple is the weight of the group. The numbers are going down, the weight is going up. And so the weight of that cohort is rising up until about, in this case, they say 6 months of age, and at that point, it starts going down. Why is it going down? Because the rate of growth has become slower than the rate of natural mortality. When they're young, this thing was growing 6-fold in 1 month. This was growing 3-fold in a month. Early on, you're getting very fast growth relative to natural mortality, and but as they get older, growth has slowed down, and the weight of the but the natural mortality has continued. In fact, now I'll go back and change this to one individual. We can do it either when you put in one individual, then this is just the probability that individual has survived. Good way to think about this is in the aquaculture context. Let's assume, in fact, let's go back to 1,000. Well, let's go back to 1,000. Just there, you put 1,000 fish in a pond, and let me put these on 2 scales, just so. Format time data series secondary axis. Okay. So the fish in your pond are growing according to this blue line, but some of the fish are dying. So at what age, if you were a farmer, what age would you harvest these fish? Yeah, at about 6 months of age, you would go out and you would take them all, assuming that the price doesn't depend upon the size. You would take them all. Well, there's 2 things. For a farmer, you would assume if the price didn't depend upon the size, and you would actually also probably harvest them a little earlier because you'd have to account for the fact you're paying for feed along the way as well. But anyway, the key point is that there is a time that you would want to harvest them, and if you wait too long, you're losing it because mortalities. But you don't want to harvest them too early, and that's really what I want to get to. So then I'm going to I've put in the assumption that these things. Now let's move away from the farm to a wild fishery. Let's say a shrimp fishery or something. And let's say that they start to be able to be caught at 3 months of age, and they start to reproduce at 4 months of age. Then we can then explore alternative harvest rates. So this one, I've got no harvesting here. Now I'm going to say, let's assume we harvest at 30% a month. Oh no, 50% a month, okay? Then, whoops, that's right, got to be comma 0.5, isn't it? Yeah, comma 5. Okay, so now what happens is they reach 5 months of age, and then, then we start harvesting them, and this cohort disappears very quickly. So, unlike a farm with a fishery, you can't really go out and catch them all at the same time. But what this means is we can then look at, and this is what this was all about. We can look at 2 things, what's called the yield per recruit. That is how much kilograms of fish we get for every 1 fish that starts out in the first month of the year, as a function of how hard you harvest. So again, if you don't harvest, you don't get any yield. And as you harvest harder and harder, 10% a month, 20% a month, 30% a month, the yield rises and then plateaus. But where it plateaus and what then happens depends upon when you start harvesting. So if I go up and I instead say that we can start harvesting them when they're 1 month of age, then this yield per recruit, if you harvest very hard, they never get a chance to grow, okay? So when you're talking size limits, you want to, 1, set your size limit so that it's not so small that they've really stopped growing, but it's not so small that they don't get a chance to spawn. And this orange is what's called the spawning biomass per recruit, and that's the total weight of mature individuals generated by 1 individual that is born. And this is very commonly used as a surrogate or a proxy for overfishing. And a real common what we typically say is if you're not allowing, if you're fishing so hard that nobody is getting a chance to spawn, the sustainability of the population is probably pretty low. And the surrogate is usually done on the order of 30 or 40% of the maximum spawning biomass per recruit. And we'll just want to put that number in your mind when we start talking about using length data, because length data is closely related to spawning biomass per recruit. That is, if your fish are small, you're not going to be generating much the fish in the catch are small, you're not going to be generating much spawning stock. Okay, let's go back to here. Okay, we need to put this in the context of fisheries management options. And I just filled in a tentative table that there's really a distinction between sedentary species and mobile species, that you've got a very different set of choices if the fish just sit there, and that, sedentary invertebrates are a classic example. A lot of reef fishes are basically sedentary, and mobile species can either have a seasonal migration or more like tunas and things move a lot. And then there's a distinction between small-scale fisheries and industrial fisheries. So in some sense, the easiest things to manage could be sedentary fisheries in small scale, on a small scale, because at that point, there's lots of examples of being able to do that management on a local basis with local devolution, as I talked about yesterday. You can have size limits, you can have seasons, you can have rotational closers. There's a whole range of data-limited ways to manage sedentary species. Industrial fisheries, it gets more complicated. Now, in a lot of the countries you come from, the industrial fisheries are probably big enough that you have the potential to manage them on the same way that they're done in other countries. You probably, again, I don't know, you may have the option of actually managing them by catch controls, but maybe not. The two kinds of things I know that are commonly used, both for industrial fisheries in the developed world, are vessel limits and seasons. So I know India has done both of those things. Both for sedentary and for mobile species, closed areas is another. It's very common to, if you know where there are breeding grounds, where you know where there are juvenile areas, you close those. Small-scale mobile species are difficult because they basically, if you're thinking of a local community, the mobile species may just come and go. It's pretty difficult to regulate them. Let's talk data options. So, size is probably where most of the data-limited methods are going, is trying to use size as a measure of fishing pressure. Size data is reasonably easily obtained. There's a lot of issues associated with getting a good sample, but it's easy to measure a fish compared to trying to age fish or trying to estimate total catch. CPUE is another, as I mentioned, that you can usually set up a system that measures CPUE, and you can do it either by tracking individual vessels. Certain fish people may keep track of records of what their catches are. It's not at all uncommon. Or at another level, you can simply, if these are day boats, you can simply go out and sample the day boats and see how many fish they're bringing in. Historical opinion on current stock status. I'm a big advocate of that. I think in many cases it may be some of the best information you have. it could be used. As I say, total catch is generally very difficult. And surveys, obviously very expensive, but as I mentioned yesterday, there are a lot of surveys out there. I know India and China both have long histories of survey data. They are not historically been used. They were sitting in files or rather than being used in assessments. I had a Chinese scientist come and spend some time in my lab, and she had just spreadsheet after spreadsheet of survey data. It had never been used. One branch of the government was sending out the boats, and another branch of government was, well, they don't really manage their fisheries very much, but they've really not done many assessments. As I said, there's international surveys like the Nansen program that's covered much of Africa and some parts of Asia. And then in local fisheries like coral reef fisheries, there's been a lot of cases of local communities setting up just simple dive surveys so the surveys aren't impossible, but I guarantee you, once you have surveys, you are really not in the data limited world anymore. Okay, let me talk briefly about this New Zealand decision rule. That, as I said, what they did back in the 1990s, the fishermen said, this fishery is not performing well. We used to get on the order of 2 kilograms of pot lift, and we would like that to be higher. And so what they ultimately did was adopt a rebuilding target. They said by 2013, we would like to be up to 2 kilograms, okay, per pot lift. And what they then did is restricted fishing to try to achieve that. And this is one of the regions in New Zealand. New Zealand's got a number of areas that this is the biggest fishery and the biggest lobster fishery in the country. And I think they got a little bit lucky, but their kilograms per pot lift increased rapidly. And then they have a decision rule. Is that this one? No, that's the decision rule was essentially, if you're significantly above this target, you actually can increase the amount of fishing that's allowed. If you're below the target, you have to decrease the amount of fishing. Okay, that's all there was to it. And assuming you can regulate the amount of fishing and you can measure CPUE, there's no reason that kind of a management system couldn't be instituted in most fisheries. And as I say, they've been extremely successful. So they had data back to the 1970s. They were getting 2 kilograms of pot lift. They made that decision to start rebuilding in the mid-90s, and it worked very well. They ended up. They do measure catch, although catch is not used in the decision rule. But they had to reduce catch. It led to rebuilding, and they've been able to increase the catch. Don't think the catch is quite as high as it was back before here. I don't think this resulted in more catch, but it resulted in more catch per effort, which meant fishing was much more profitable. Okay, which I'm going. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I want to just talk about now multi-species fisheries, particularly tropical fisheries, which I suspect is the circumstance for many, if not most of you. And as near as we can tell, the majority of long-lived species throughout the tropics of the world have been pretty severely depleted. That there are surveys, there's a whole bunch of good evidence that fishing pressure is very high. I know for India, working with some Indian scientists, they've estimated that the intensity of trawling in Indian waters And the number we use is what's called the swept area ratio. So you calculate the area trawled by trawlers each year, and you divide that by the total area of the continental shelf. So for Iceland, that's a number on the order of 0.2 or 0.3. That the total area fished is maybe 20 or 30% of the continental shelf. Well, for much of India, it's 10. Okay, that every square meter on average of the Indian shelf is being dragged with a trawl 10 times a year, and so that in itself is going to tell you there aren't many long-lived big fish left. That's a fact of life. This is a paper by some of my friends where they were looking at Chinese fisheries, and I just want to. And they ended up doing some ecosystem models using size-based models. So indiscriminate and intense fishing, this is from their abstract, has occurred in many marine ecosystems around the world. Although this practice may have negative effects on biodiversity and populations of individual species, it may also increase total fisheries productivity by reducing predatory fish. So the big, long-lived, often carnivorous fish are largely gone. And the evidence they have, and this paper's got pretty thorough analysis, our results, so what they're concluding is they've eliminated most of the large predatory fish. The smaller non-predatory fish are now actually surviving better and are more productive. And so their modeling suggests that implementing single species management in currently lightly managed and highly exploited multi-species fisheries, so these Chinese fisheries are both lightly managed, essentially one closed period a year, and they're highly exploited, may result in decreases in global catch. So that's a very important, because if you go out and you apply the single species methods that we use, you'd say, oh, this is overfished, this is overfished, this is overfished. You need to rebuild those stocks. What their modeling suggests that if you did that, the total catch of those Chinese fisheries would decline. So this is just sort of a caution that you need to think beyond the single species when you start thinking about how to manage these fisheries. This is from data from a paper from Kenyan coral reefs. Tim McClanahan is the lead author, and Tim has been running a program for quite a few years, monitoring, estimating both catch and catch per effort and effort in along a section of the Kenya coastline. This is all the marine coastline, and so these are different sites. Standardized as number of fishers per kilometer per day. So that's fishing pressure, how many boats there are. And this is the annual catch in kilograms per year. Okay? And what you see is the carnivorous fish, these dots are down, so at these heavily fished sites, there's really no carnivorous fish left. And again, carnivorous fish tend to be longer lived. And what you see is a boom both in herbivorous fish, or here, and octopuses, which are, no, these are the octopuses. These are the, where's the herbivorous fish? That's the circles. Here's the herbivorous fish here. And these squares are the diamonds. So, I mean, I was shocked when I first met Tim, and he said, where I come from, the more you fish, the more you catch. Now, it turns out that because carnivorous fish are more valuable than herbivorous fish, he's really trying to convince the local fishermen they would better operate about this range where they actually still get some carnivorous fish. Let me see. How are we doing on time? Let me just jump ahead. Well, okay, if you dive into, and I know this, you haven't had any population dynamics, so I don't want to get into stock assessment. That if you dive into the data poor fisheries analysis and exclude what are often called data poor methods that depend upon catch, so catch-free data poor, you're really into the world of length. And the fact is that in general, the distribution of lengths tells you something about the distribution, the amount of fishing pressure, and there are reference points and proxies that can be used to decide if you're overfished or if you're not. And I think I'm just going to stop there. Yeah. No, I won't. This is well. I just say that Merrill, as part of her thesis, developed because most of these data poor methods have come from people working in the developed world. They've always typically assumed you have catch data. And of course you have catch data because there's the FAO catch data. Well, the FAO catch data for small stocks isn't very reliable. And so Merrill has been working on a series of an overall method that can use a time series of length data but does not require catch data. But I won't have time to go into it, and I think I'll stop at that point.